Legal predictability, so essential to trade and cross-border cooperation, can become harder to guarantee. Critics of the shift raised a cautious concern that autonomy, without interoperability, could narrow horizons rather than expand them, that stepping away from shared frameworks might complicate mutual recognition, delay cooperation, or reduce external confidence in domestic rulings. The second risk was internal. Sovereignty in law does not end with control over infrastructure. It depends on credibility, on whether judges are seen as independent, protected, and accountable. International organizations and observers have at times questioned developments within Burkina Faso's judicial environment, calling for transparency and due process in sensitive cases. These concerns did not negate the pursuit of autonomy, but they sharpened its test, because sovereignty claimed must also be sovereignty trusted. Here, the transitional authorities faced a paradox. To prove independence from external norms, institutions had to demonstrate strength internally through consistency, fairness, and restraint. Without that, the very argument for breaking from inherited systems risked losing its moral ground. Yet beyond the risks lay a horizon that many across the Sahel recognized instinctively. If Burkina Faso could pause participation in a long-standing legal network without collapse, it suggested that such arrangements were not immutable, that alternatives could be imagined, that cooperation could be renegotiated rather than inherited. This is why the move resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. In regions where legal frameworks often arrive pre-shaped, the act of stepping back itself became a signal, not of rejection, but of choice. Not of isolation, but of deliberation. Observers began to ask a different question. What if sovereignty in the Sahel was no longer about replacing one external anchor with another, but about building institutions capable of engaging on equal terms? In that framing, judicial autonomy was neither retreat nor rupture. It was preparation. Preparation for partnerships defined by consent rather than continuity. Preparation for standards written locally, then shared outward. Preparation for a legal order that reflects lived realities rather than inherited templates. The road ahead remains uncertain. Isolation is a risk, fragmentation is a possibility, but so is precedent. Because when one nation redraws the boundaries of the legal authority, others begin to imagine that they can too. And that imagination, once awakened, rarely remains contained. Burkina Faso did not leave a courtroom in protest. It did not tear up a treaty on live television. It stepped away from a network. And trust, once questioned, demands transparency in return. Yet the alternative is also clear. A system where standards are inherited without consent may offer stability, but it rarely delivers dignity. And dignity, once demanded, does not retreat easily. Across the Sahel, other nations are watching, not to copy, but to measure what is possible, to ask whether law can be both sovereign and connected, whether cooperation can be chosen rather than assumed, whether legal systems can speak with their own voice before joining a global chorus. This is why the story matters beyond Burkina Faso. Because when a single country redraws the boundaries of legal authority, it alters the imagination of an entire region. And imagination, in politics, is often the first step toward transformation. In a world where influence increasingly flows through institutions rather than armies, will be shaped not only by power, but by principle, by who defines legitimacy, and on whose terms. Burkina Faso has not finished writing this chapter, but it has made one thing clear. The age of silent inheritance is fading, and a new conversation about law, dignity, and continental agency has begun. If this moment speaks to your sense of justice and sovereignty, stay with us. The next chapter of this story is already unfolding. No tanks rolled in, no borders were crossed, no declaration of war was made, yet something far quieter and far more consequential had just happened. In a brief announcement from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso stepped back from a francophone judicial network that had shaped legal standards far beyond its borders. No spectacle, no drama, just a line drawn, not on a map, but inside the law. For decades, power in the Sahel was not exercised only through soldiers or diplomats. It moved through courtrooms, through codes of conduct, through invisible rules written elsewhere, then applied at home. And then that connection was paused, not because of a trial, not because of a verdict, but because the very idea of who gets to write the rules was being questioned. Stay with us. This is not a legal footnote. It is a quiet shift in power. This is the story of Burkina Faso, of sovereignty beyond uniforms and embassies, of how judicial networks became instruments of influence, and why breaking from them may signal the end of an old order across the Sahel. Because when a nation steps away from the rule-making table, it is not always retreating. Sometimes it is preparing to build its own. It did not begin with a speech. It did not arrive with fanfare. It began in a procedural setting, inside the Supreme Council of the Judiciary of Burkina Faso, during what was described as a statutory session. The language was administrative, the tone restrained, but the implication was anything but minor. Burkina Faso announced that it was suspending its participation in the Réseau francophone des conseils de la magistrature judiciaire, a francophone judicial network known as the RFCMJR. To many outside the legal world, the name meant little. Yet within the architecture of influence, the network mattered. The RFCMJ is not a court. It does not issue verdicts. It does not deploy power openly. Instead, it operates where power often lasts longest, in standards, in ethics, in shared norms that quietly define how judges are trained, evaluated, and recognized across borders. It is a space where judicial councils exchange frameworks, best practices, and professional codes, all under the wider ecosystem of the Francophonie. For years, Burkina Faso sat at the table. Then it stepped away. The timing was not accidental. The decision followed the country's withdrawal from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, a move justified by officials as a response to what they described as political drift away from the organization's original cultural mandate. Seen together, the pattern became harder to ignore. This was not a single break. It was a sequence. First, the language community, then the legal network, and in between, a growing insistence from the transitional authorities that sovereignty could no longer be segmented. Military independence on one side, legal dependency on the other. Under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, sovereignty was being redefined as something infrastructural, something systemic, something embedded deep inside institutions rather than displayed on parade grounds. In that framing, judicial networks were no longer neutral platforms. They were conduits of rule-making power, places where norms were shaped long before they were ever contested. Pausing participation in the RFCMJ did not dismantle a court. It did something subtler. It interrupted a flow of training, a flow of reference points, a flow of authority that had long moved quietly without needing permission. Supporters of the move framed it as a necessary assertion, a recalibration of who set standards and answers to whom. Critics, more cautiously, wondered whether stepping away risked isolation from international legal cooperation. Both interpretations pointed to the same reality. This was no bureaucratic adjustment. It was a statement about ownership, of law, of process, of legitimacy, and it raised a question that could not be contained within Burkina Faso's borders. If judicial sovereignty becomes a frontier of political change, what happens to the old legal order built on shared external norms? Because once a nation questions who writes the rules, it rarely stops at one network. Power does not always arrive with uniforms. More often it comes quietly, through templates, training manuals, codes of conduct, and conferences held far from public view. Long before a law is enforced, it is imagined. Long before a verdict is delivered, the rules that shape judgment are already in place. This was the architecture of the old order. Across much of Francophone Africa, influence endured not because courts were controlled, but because standards were shared. Judicial councils exchanged ethics frameworks. Magistrates trained under common professional norms. Career paths, evaluations, and institutional expectations were aligned with reference points that originated elsewhere. This was not coercion. It did not need to be. It was continuity. Networks like the RFCMJ sat at the center of this ecosystem. They did not command courts. They connected them. They did not impose rulings. They harmonized thinking. And in doing so, they created something far more durable than direct authority: legitimacy. In this system, power worked upstream. If you shaped how judges were trained, how ethics were defined, how professional excellence was measured, then you shaped outcomes long before any case reached the courtroom. This was rule-making power. For decades, France and the wider Francophonie cultivated this layer carefully, not as an empire, but as an inheritance. A shared legal language, shared institutional memory, shared assumptions about what justice should look like and who should arbitrate it. France-Afrique did not survive only through contracts and soldiers. It survived through norms. Aid could be withdrawn. Troops could be redeployed. But standards endured. They lived in handbooks, in seminar rooms, in judicial exchanges that appeared technical, neutral, even benevolent. And that was precisely the point, because when influence is embedded in procedure, it does not announce itself as power. It presents itself as best practice. Yet this architecture also had a cost. It meant that sovereignty was often incomplete, exercised at the level of enforcement, but diluted at the level of design. Laws were applied nationally, but shaped transnationally. Independence existed in form, while frameworks arrived pre-packaged. For years, this imbalance remained largely unquestioned. It was efficient. It was familiar. And for many institutions facing limited resources, it felt safer than experimentation. But safety has a shadow. As political currents shifted across the Sahel, so did perceptions of this old order. What once looked like cooperation began to feel like constraint. What once appeared neutral started to resemble inertia, a system that preserved continuity at the expense of choice. In this light, judicial networks were no longer invisible. They became visible precisely because they were everywhere. In Ouagadougou, this realization hardened into a conviction that sovereignty could not coexist with outsourced standards indefinitely. Not charity, not training, but authorship. Breaking from a judicial network then was not about rejecting law. It was about reclaiming the authority to define it, to decide which norms applied and which no longer did. This was the moral contrast at the heart of the shift. Integration versus autonomy, stability versus authorship, inheritance versus intention. And as Burkina Faso paused its participation, it was not dismantling an old system overnight. It was signaling that the era of unexamined continuity was ending. But dismantling is always easier than replacement. Once the old scaffolding is questioned, a harder task emerges: building something new without losing credibility, cooperation, or trust. And that challenge was already waiting. The shift did not announce itself with slogans. It arrived through systems. For the leadership in Ouagadougou, sovereignty was no longer framed as posture or symbolism. It was framed as infrastructure, something measurable, operational, and embedded in daily life. And nowhere was that clearer than in the justice system. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the argument hardened into a principle. A nation cannot claim independence if its citizens cannot access justice without friction, delay, or external dependence. Law, in this view, was not merely a domain of authority. It was a service, and services reveal who truly governs. That conviction translated into action. Over the past 2 years, Burkina Faso accelerated the digitization of core judicial processes. What once required days of travel, queues, and intermediaries was redirected into national platforms, built, managed, and controlled at home. The numbers told a story that speeches did not need to explain. More than 418,000 requests for criminal record extracts were received through the online system. Of those, over 393,000 were processed and delivered. Alongside them, Close to 49,000 applications for nationality certificates moved through digital channels that did not exist just a few years earlier. These were not pilot projects, they were scale. The financial footprint mattered too. In 2 years, the platforms generated more than 337 million CFA francs in public revenue, funds retained within national systems, rather than leaking through informal pathways. But the deeper significance was not monetary. It was structural. When citizens can obtain legal documents through national infrastructure, the state reasserts itself as the primary interface of justice, not an intermediary, not a gatekeeper for external standards, but an author of process. This is where the shift became unmistakable. Judicial sovereignty, as framed by the current authorities, was not about rejecting law. It was about owning the machinery that delivers it, about deciding how access is granted, how timelines are set, how accountability is enforced. In that context, judicial networks were reassessed through a different lens. If sovereignty is infrastructure, then standards imported without adaptation become vulnerabilities. If justice is a service, then dependence, even benevolent, becomes a liability. This is why the pause from the Francophone judicial network cannot be separated from domestic reform. One is subtraction, the other is construction, breaking an external circuit while reinforcing an internal one. Supporters of the transition pointed to efficiency and reach. Digital systems reduced discretion, limited bottlenecks, and created traceable pathways. Critics, more cautious, warned that technology alone does not guarantee independence, that institutions require safeguards as well as servers. Both were right, but neither could deny the direction of travel. Law was being repositioned as a field of sovereignty, not coordination, as an arena where legitimacy must be produced internally before it can be shared externally. And this is where the story moved beyond administration. Because when a state demonstrates that it can design, fund, and operate its own legal infrastructure, it challenges an assumption that has long underpinned post-colonial governance, that standards must arrive from outside in order to function. This was not a rejection of cooperation, it was a renegotiation of terms, from adoption to authorship, from alignment to agency, from inherited frameworks to intentional design. It is here that naturally belongs, not as a slogan, but as a lived process unfolding through databases, applications, and court registries. Yet, asserting control is only the first step, because once law becomes a frontier of sovereignty, it attracts scrutiny from partners, from observers, and from within. And the most difficult test was still ahead. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the decision did not go unnoticed. Judicial networks rarely make headlines, but when a state steps away from them, capitals listen, quietly at first, then with growing attention. Because this was not simply about courts, it was about alignment. For the Francophonie, the pause carried symbolic weight. Burkina Faso had not only been a participant in its legal ecosystem, it had been part of the shared institutional narrative that framed Francophone cooperation as cultural, technical, and neutral. Losing a Sahelian member at this level signaled a fracture not of language, but of confidence. For France, the implications were more delicate. This was not a diplomatic rupture. No ambassadors were recalled, no statements escalated. Yet a layer of influence, the kind that operates without flags or uniforms, was thinning. Legal standards, training exchanges, and professional reference points had long functioned as a stabilizing bridge between Paris and its former spheres of influence. That bridge was no longer taken for granted. Officials avoided public confrontation. Instead, reactions were framed in the language of concern, cooperation, and continuity. But beneath the measured tone lay a recalculation. Influence anchored in institutions is harder to restore once it is questioned. Across the Sahel, the signal traveled faster. In Bamako and Niamey, policymakers were watching closely. These were governments that had already challenged regional security frameworks and political alliances. Now a new domain was opening: law itself. If one country could pause participation in a judicial network without immediate collapse, What did that mean for others navigating similar debates about autonomy and alignment? This is where the ripple widened. Judicial cooperation has often been treated as a political realm of technocrats and ethics codes, but Burkina Faso's move reframed it as strategic, as a choice rather than a default. And choices create precedence. International partners outside the Francophone sphere observed from a different angle. For them, the question was not cultural, but structural. Could a state redraw its legal partnerships without isolating itself from global norms? Could sovereignty and interoperability coexist? Here, interpretations diverged. Some analysts saw opportunity, space for diversification, for new partnerships, for legal systems tailored more closely to local realities. Others warned of fragmentation, of parallel standards emerging, complicating cooperation in trade, investment, and cross-border justice. Both perspectives converge on one point. Law had become geopolitical. No longer merely a domestic affair, it was now part of how states positioned themselves in a shifting global order, alongside energy, security, and supply chains. In that landscape was no longer an abstract concept, but a variable shaped by institutional choices. Yet the most profound implications lay closer to home. As external observers debated alignment and influence, the legitimacy of the shift would ultimately be tested internally by citizens, lawyers, judges, and the everyday functioning of justice, because sovereignty asserted abroad must still be sustained within. And that is where the real risk and the real horizon began to take shape. Every assertion of sovereignty carries a cost. Once the old scaffolding is questioned, the protection it offered, however imperfect, no longer comes for free. For Burkina Faso, the decision to step away from an established judicial network opened a space filled with possibility. It also exposed a set of risks that could not be ignored. The first was isolation. Judicial cooperation does more than harmonize ethics. It facilitates trust between courts, between states, between investors and institutions. When shared standards weaken, uncertainty grows.